Hello, everybody. Welcome on the Lights on Data show. I'm very happy to be here with Anthony, who's a fellow data podcast host. He's a fellow data professional, and so much more.
I'm going to introduce Anthony. So, our guest today is a data leadership advocate who has led data transformation in many industries as a consultant, data architect, program lead, and chief data officer. He hosts a weekly video podcast, Data Leadership Lessons, highlighting how people can use data leadership to make an impact in their organizations. Anthony is the founder of multiple businesses. Algmin Data Leadership, providing data leadership education and content. Algmin Business Media, taking professional video content easy, making professional video content easy for everyone with a message to share. He can often be found at conferences and online as one of the Dataversity's most dynamic and popular speakers. We are very happy to have you here, Anthony. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
We will start with a personal question, as we usually do. You have a very big family, Anthony. Congratulations for that. Tell us a little bit about what you do on your spare time with your family or what you're passionate about.
So I do have three children, a wife and three children, and identical twins that are now 6 years old.
Wow.
And a son who's 11. My son and I get along very well. He does a lot of Lego and certainly has a technology bend. He does motion animation and things, so that's pretty
Wow.
fun to work with him. And then the girls are precocious and wonderful, and we have a lot of fun playing with them. I'd say in terms of a hobby, one of the things, I've always been a car person. I used to take my car to the track back when I had a car that could go on a track, and did some stuff with that and do sim racing and stuff for fun, and that's
Wow.
cool. But where it's really collided recently is that I've become a huge advocate for battery electric vehicles, and so it's kind of taking my data and technology nerd side and mashing it up with the car fan side. And so I've been really into those lately, and so I've learned a lot about that. So that's kind of a personal hobby of driving an electric car. I also have a long commute, so it's nice to have a cheaper mode of transportation. But it's been something that is, I think, a really interesting time actually in the auto industry of how these automakers are choosing strategically towards going to battery electric vehicles, the place that hybrid vehicles plays now. As a student of business, as a student of data, as a student of technology, it's you can't really get any better than that at this point, I think.
Absolutely.
I
And
love it.
there's in the news now, there's been, I think, Hertz that just purchased a bunch of Teslas, and I think Avis is following up next. And so there's definitely a lot more interest. I know in Vancouver, here in Vancouver, Canada, there's going to be, maybe in a couple of years from now, an Indy racing, but it will all be electric vehicles. So that will be very interesting.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time, and the pace of innovation, the new cars hitting the market in the next few years, it's going to be amazing. It really does feel like driving the future when you're behind the wheel of one.
Yeah. So Anthony, you like to live in the fast lane, with all this your passion for driving in cars and data leadership and data governance, data management in general. I got to put that as a fast lane type of work as well.
I like that my risk profile as a father and middle-aged man at this point. At some point I got old. So the fast lane may not be quite as accurate anymore, but I do like the allusion to the data leadership piece, because it all drives from a desire to be pragmatic, a desire to create real change. And I really get impatient and frustrated when we make things too academic or make things too theoretical. I want to be able to apply them in ways that really impact businesses. And as we talk more about data leadership, we'll learn more about that. But I think that it really is about driving motion forward and creating that kind of thing. So I like that analogy a lot.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, no, we were curious. How did data leadership become your thing?
Well, it comes back. So I grew up in my first jobs out of college in the late 90s and early 2000s were in the technology development area. So I was doing programming and data systems and data warehousing and all of that stuff at a pretty detailed technical level. Even though I always, as long as I can remember, always thought of myself as a business minded person first. Like that was always a thing, and I could see technology being this means to an end that would help businesses thrive. And so I was doing all this technical work. I was interested. I'm a big nerd. It's fine. And so I did this work and realized in that we were not making as big of a difference in the businesses as the technology seemed that it had the potential to do. And so I started to study that as a student of both the technology and the business. And as I got into consulting, so I talk about the first act of my career was building technology for a decade and doing data systems and stuff. And the second act of my career was going into consulting after getting an MBA and kind of connecting this technology to the business strategy side. And then in consulting, I learned that there was this whole thing called data management and data governance. And it fascinated me because I'm like, I've just been making it up for the
Mm.
last 10 years. I just did what made sense to me, but I didn't realize there was this whole world of thought around it. And so as I was in the 2010s, I'm like, this all starting to really gel for me, but we're doing a terrible job because we have the technologists over there doing one thing, and we have all these data people in this other place talking about data, but not necessarily connecting it to the technology, connecting it to the business outcomes. It's like they were all just islands. I'm like, guys, these are all too interrelated to be as separate as they are. And so data leadership as an overlay kind of became this way that we connect the business strategy and the business operational side with the technology potential and the potential that was ever increasing with our data assets and really make them real. It was all about saying, hey, we're creating all these potential assets or assets that have potential value, and we're not capitalizing on them. What do we need to do to capitalize on them? And that was the nugget. That was the nugget that made data leadership become real in my mind. And so then I started to break it down. I started talking about it. I started doing a lot of conference speaking with Dataversity and things like that. And that led to writing, that led to a book. And it just kept building on these ideas. And I'm like, if somebody could ever tell me when I'm wrong about this stuff, then I'll move in a different direction. But it just seemed to land. It just seemed to make sense to people. And so I've kind of just kept going with it. And so data leadership for the last many years has really been the thing that kind of unites all of the work that I do.
So how do you define data leadership?
Right. So it all starts with data value. And the way I
Mhm.
define data value
This is
is
music to
saying,
George's ears, by the way, when he hears
what's
data
that?
value. It's
Oh,
music to George's ears when he hears
nice.
about
Good.
data value.
And like any good speaker or quote unquote thought leader, I like to make up my own definitions for terms. So hopefully we have alignment on what we consider data value or data leadership. But for me, data value is really about saying, okay, we have data. People seem to think it's valuable, but what does that really mean? Well, to me, value only comes, and I put my business leader hat on, and the value only comes if I can drive a measurable impact in the outcomes of my business.
Mhm.
And that means improving revenue, decreasing costs, or somehow improving risk management, which can, filter into cost and benefit. But at the end of the day, that's what I care about as a business leader. That's what matters to my organization. That was what matters to my
Right.
stakeholders. That's what makes us successful. So if I say data value, what does that mean to me? Well, that means I need to take data assets and make them have value in the ways that my business determines value exists. And that is the
Mhm.
revenue, cost, or risk management impacts. And that's it. Data value is the differential that you get in your business by putting that data in motion, doing something with that data, driving better activities, driving better decisions from that data, from those insights, from that knowledge, whatever derivation of data or technology or work you do with that data, it has to resolve to a revenue, cost, or risk management metric for real value to get created. And that is really, to me, that's the foundation. That's data value at its core. And I see that being the goal, but that's not what we get to decide. We don't just get to walk into a business in the morning and say, let's go create some data value. Let's make data value. You don't get to do that. What you can do, though, is take actions and make decisions that take into account likely results from a cost or revenue or risk management perspective, and do those, and then measure and see what happened. And
Right.
that, to me, is data leadership. Data leadership is the art of maximizing the data value we achieve. And so it is an art. It is something that brings together all of these things that we've already been talking about, whether it's data or technology or people or process or, business opportunities and innovation and operations. And think about all these different things that go on in a business, in an organization, to create the value that the business sees. Data is a big part of that, but it works in tandem with everything else. And that, to me, is data leadership. Data leadership is about saying, hey, there's this asset here. If we're not using it, it's going to waste, and it's creating
Mm-hmm.
negative value, actually,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a cost associated with having that asset in the first place. So let's just recognize that there's impacts to that. And it starts with first measuring and understanding those relationships, and then going and trying to maximize them through the actions that we take as leaders in whatever roles we find ourselves in the business.
Yeah, a great definition. I have a follow-up question to that, but I want to take this comment from Scott Taylor saying, excellent definition. Data must grow, improve, and protect the business.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
totally agree with Scott.
So my follow-up question, Anthony, is who should drive that data leadership? Is there any role in particular? Should be everybody?
So it is definitely in my mind everybody. I've done a lot of collaborative work with Bob Seiner, and he says everybody's a data steward. Get over it,
Right.
and I
Right.
love that, because to me, everybody in your organization should be creating value for your organization through whatever efforts they have. Can data improve those? Probably. And so, from my perspective, we all should be data leaders. We are all working with data in interesting and novel ways in our particular roles and functions, or we should be using data. We're probably using some sort of data today to do those things, but we could probably be using it more effectively. So, yeah, I think everybody should be a data leader, because data can pretty much improve everybody's role in some way or another. And so I
Hmm.
think that it's incumbent on all of us to find opportunities to improve what we do by leveraging data. And I think it's that simple.
This reminds me of certain companies that, to them, the internal culture is everybody's sort of a data analyst. You
Mhm.
work in HR, you have the opportunity to look into that data that you're working with, see if you can uncover anything meaningful and derive any information out of it that will help you in your role. So I think in that sense, it's that really ties into that data leadership, and everybody is a data leader, regardless of their position.
Yeah, and I would say, going even beyond data analyst, I think most people should be data activists. And that is, instead of just looking at what the data can tell me, I should be thinking about a bi-directional relationship with data and saying, hey, I not only have the ability to use data that I have access to or I can view as it stands today, I also have an opportunity to collect more data and to create more data for future benefit. And so when I
Yeah.
think about, folks that often aren't maybe as considered as, data focused, somebody who's, a police officer or a plumber. A plumber would be a good example, right? So a plumber is working with real stuff all day, and as a person who lives virtually and does most of his work virtually, I love doing real things, plumbing projects around the house. Bring it on, right? But I think about that, they're going to encounter similar but somewhat unique challenges every single day. And there's going to be data that they have. They have, what did people pay? What did my materials cost? What were my labor costs and all of that? But you can think about, what about capturing more of the kinds of circumstances you encounter? What do I
Hmm.
tend to need if I need this one thing? How often do I also need this other kind of fitment or this other kind of epoxy or whatever the kinds of
Hmm.
tools that they're using are? There's probably some patterns there that are not immediately obvious, but if you had captured some data, you might be able to be more efficient in the future. And that's just a simple off the cuff analogy. As my team will tell you, like, I'm always trying to come up with off the cuff analogies. Not all of them work, but Some of them do, and this is one I'll give it a B. But it's definitely
It
something where
works.
if we think about what we're doing, and this is true in our professional lives, it can also be true in our personal lives. If we can capture some data around it, we need to think about, okay, what might this be useful for to drive improvements versus what's just going to create noise? Because there's a flip side to data leadership that I think is really important as well. And that is collecting data, capturing data. Usually the incremental cost of that's very small. It doesn't hurt to collect it. But what we run the risk of doing anytime we start acting with data is that we start to create things that are interesting but ineffective. And so we have to be very careful not to accidentally substitute action for progress.
Hmm.
I talk about sometimes machines that create heat instead of horsepower. And
Mhm.
that's where, if we think about that, like I love my cars. So that's, thinking about heat versus horsepower, just because you have motion, just because something's happening doesn't mean that is productive happening. And so we fall into that trap with data a lot, or with reporting a lot, because people are like, I want something because it gives me comfort, but it doesn't drive any differential in my outcomes. So
Yeah.
we have to reorient, always orient back. What's valuable here? What causes a differential in outcome, not just a same outcome with more comfort? That doesn't get you to revenue, cost, or risk management. And
Hmm.
that's the thing we have to avoid. Don't just buy the toys. Don't just do the interesting things. Do the impactful things. That's where the real leadership happens when it comes to data. It's essential to have something that creates motion, but that motion needs to be productive as well.
I like that. Sometimes when you're looking at, or some people are looking at dashboards, reports, and they say, "Oh, that's interesting," but that's all there is to it. It's just well, what does that mean? If there's no action that impels you to take, then it's really not that valuable, is it? But the other side of the coin of gathering all this data, I was thinking there are companies that gather it, they store it, they never use it, turns into that dark data, comes with other issues. And I would imagine with data leadership in place, there's less of a chance of that happening, right? You're kind of looking at all the data that you're collecting and trying to see, well, how can we use it?
Right. Well, and that's the thing, is that there's not a guaranteed of positive improvement when you take action. There's a risk that it gets worse. And that's true of data. The data has a risk inherent with it, especially when you start talking about data, customer data, which is probably really potentially valuable, could also be really potentially detrimental. Right. And
Right.
so we have to manage that, recognizing that we're looking for those differentials that lead to positive outcomes. But anytime we start taking action, there is that risk of negative side. And that, just the collection of data is inherently an action with some embedded amount of risk. Just capturing and storing that data has a risk associated with it. We need to be conscious. And this is what underlies so much of what we do in data leadership, is saying it's time to be deliberate about all actions. We don't default to anything just saying, well, that's what we always do, so that's what we're going to do. We have to say, we are going to do this with the expectation that this is going to happen. We are going to measure it and see if we were right. And if we were right, then we're going to do more of that if it's a positive thing, And so that's how we learn from it. It's that iterative approach by driving with the insights that we get. And it comes back to recognizing that we have to be willing to make future adjustments. We have to listen to the data. It always drives me nuts when I think about how much business strategy is informed by data and ignored. Like
Mhm.
that data will feed the executives, and they'll be like, well, we see all the data and we're going to do what we want anyway. And it's like, why did we even do this? Why do we even put together the research if we were going to ignore it and do what we wanted to anyway? We're just going to do the wrong thing with more awareness that it's wrong. That doesn't lead to a benefit or cost or risk management adjustment. And that's, to me, those are the things that we have to watch out for, because we could mean well and do something completely detrimental. And that's not good, right? It all comes back to the real impacts, and having the discipline to be deliberate about our actions and to measure the outcomes and to change when the data tells us to do something different, while also recognizing that the data doesn't always have the whole story, right? Like, the data is the best approximation of truth that we have, but it's not truth. It's not perfect. So we also have to recognize, hey, it's just, it kind of cracks me up. I think about the financial statements, right? Everybody has the financial statements and they're like, past performance is not indicative of future results. I'm like, then why are you telling me what the past performance was? Like, this is exactly what you're implying by showing me the trends. but then you use this disclaimer because you don't want to be held liable for that. Well, therein, I mean, that's it. That's the part about data that is imperfect, right? You can't look backwards and all of a sudden know the future with certainty, but it's still the best we have. Like, and that's the thing that I wish they would add to those financial statements. Like, well, it's not going to tell you what's going to happen in the future, but it's the best you got, so you might as well go with it, right? And like, that's really what our relationship with data should be when we're thinking about it from an analytics and driving these kinds of improvements with data leadership.
Loving it. Now, Anthony, what do you think is that relationship between data leadership and data governance?
Oh, I love this one. So this data governance is, I mean, that's where like I started when I started to go into consulting, right? And I was like very green, and I'm like, wait, data governance? What is this business? I've been doing this just kind of on the fly, just saying, hey, we need to understand what this means. Data governance, and classic. I'll bring my friend Bob into this again. We often talk in the data management community. Bob definitely says this in a lot of his talks, is that whether or not you are coordinating it and acting and having created a good organization to do data governance, you have data governance. You have something that is providing the working infrastructure for your data. So people are using data. It may be completely federated. People just may be doing the best darn job they can with the data that they have, but it's inconsistent, it has problems or whatever, but it's still being governed. It's just being governed by chaos to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
The counter for data leadership is that if you don't have data leadership, you don't have data leadership. Data leadership has very clear objectives here. Governance has a lot of things it could be doing, right? But it's about controlling the data. It's about the data. Data leadership is about the business. And if you don't make that connection doesn't exist. And so when we think about maximizing data value, when we think about taking deliberate action, those are necessary precursors to having data leadership. You don't have it, data leadership doesn't exist. With data governance, you have something, it's just not good. And when you have them together, that's when you're really amplifying it in a great level. So to have good data leadership, you probably need good data governance. To have good data governance, you're probably thinking about data leadership as well. But I would say more organizations out there, because of the nature of our organizational structures, tend to think about the data as an entity and as something that needs to be treated by itself. And that's where data governance, I think, has a lot of trouble lasting and being effective in the long term, because it's a little bit too far removed from its value proposition. I think data governance's value proposition is the same one data leadership has. It's just not as clearly defined a lot of times. And so I think they start to become the same thing, and that the data governance activities are part of what you need to do to be effective with data in your organization and to create valuable impacts.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not all of them, nor is data leadership only thinking about data governance. It's thinking about a lot of other things. But I think data governance is a discipline that is essential to have great data leadership.
Nice.
I love it.
Yeah.
So, Anthony, you have a lot of initiatives. So, you wrote a book, you have a podcast, so you're trying to help people be successful with data leadership. And my question is, what compels you to do that? What is your motivation behind it?
I feel like I'm very fortunate that I found relatively early in my career what my life's work is about. And what I do and what data is and what data leadership is about. It's called to me. It has always been calling to me, and I found it, and that's very exciting for me in my career. I've always struggled with context. Where do I do data leadership most effectively? And so I bounced around to a bunch of different companies, a bunch of different kinds of roles, consulting, industry side, you name it. And one thread that has always been interesting to me is trying to elevate how good we can do this stuff, and the recognition that the work I do directly myself cannot ever be as impactful as my ability to help others do that work as well. And so for me, doing this data leadership stuff, the advocacy, the training and the book and the podcast and stuff, I feel extremely fortunate that I know what my life's work is about. I feel extremely fortunate that I'm enough of a technology nerd to figure out things like podcast hosting and things like that, because there's a lot of people out there that have really important messages, and you guys know from doing this show, it's a tough process to do these things, and that gets in the way of a bunch of messages that need to be out there. And so for me, I'm like, I have the drive to do this, and so I do it because somebody else who should get a similar message out just won't be able to, or won't have the interest in going to that level. And so for me, it's something that I feel, because I've made these connections, and I've been talking about these things, and they've helped me be successful in the various roles that I've had. I feel the least I can do is try to help others find that kind of thing, find their life's work, find where this stuff matters, and hopefully make them more successful doing that. Because I look around this industry at the two of you, at others. I mean, Scott had made a comment earlier, like, these are the people who taught me how to do this. And this is a community. This is a place where we need to help each other, because there are far too few people in this community doing this, and doing this effectively, at a time where data and technology are so important and they're growing so fast. I just wish that we have more of these kinds of conversations, more of these kinds of opportunities for people to elevate what they're doing, so the businesses can get better with this. I think it's going to be essential to the future success and the future growth of all of our organizations. Data is no longer a nice to have. It is an absolute necessity. If you want to be successful, data leadership is something you need to do. It is something, it's table stakes now. And so we need more people doing it. And that, to me, is that's my responsibility for having been so fortunate finding my calling in my career.
Absolutely. And I do want to encourage everybody to check out dataleadershiplessons.com for your podcast. A lot of great content there, a lot of great interviews.
I just wanted to say that the first time that I heard Anthony, my first thought was, wow, he has a broadcasting voice. He's perfect for podcasting.
Yeah. I've also been told I have a face for radio, but I continue to insist on doing a radio show as well. So a terrible joke, I know.
We have a few questions coming in. I just want to take the moment to bring Gus here, and he's wondering, which has been the most difficult field where your domain knowledge has not been enough to have a proper approach to resolve problems? Has that ever happened to you?
It's an interesting question. And for me, I've managed to be successful across a number of different industries and data domains, because the patterns are very similar across them. And it reminds me of some of the most important advice that I give to consultants, is that, we learn the patterns. The patterns you can study, you can figure those out, and you can see them very quickly. But if you want to be especially effective, you need to be able to immediately understand the pattern, but then drive deeper and understand what makes this domain, or what makes this company, or what makes this group unique. Because there's always something, otherwise they'd be the same company as somebody else. There's always some things that are unique to their challenges, and you need to pull those forward, so you know how to adapt that pattern and really understand what's happening here, because these are complex issues and they're never exactly the same. And if we treat them as exactly the same, we are not being as efficient and effective in what we're doing to help them in what needs to happen. So when I think about my role in data leadership and my functional background, what I care about doing from a technologist point of view, leave the data leadership strategy stuff on the side, is I build data platforms. I build platforms that the data scientists or others use. And so for me, it's okay to work at a pattern-based level, understanding some of the key changes that exist, because I'm not trying to replicate all of that domain knowledge that the specialist will have. And I'm wired weird, because that's something that I've always enjoyed across all the industries. I used to build, data warehouses and trading reconciliation for the trading industry in the financial sector. I've done it in healthcare. I've done it in insurance. And it's always been like, I want to give those people who are the domain experts all the tools they need. But I don't have to be a master sculptor myself to create great clay, or to create a great knife. And that's, to me, I can focus on building the tools so long as I can extend that and understand the kinds of challenges they have, even though I can't ever do it myself anywhere near as well as they would. And that happens daily for me, is to recognize, like, I have my limitations, but if I can feed into that, I think a lot in APIs, because like I've mentioned, I'm a big technology nerd, but it's about creating that handoff in a way that what I do can link up seamlessly with what you do, and you can take
Mhm.
it and run with it. And that's really the foundation of these application programming interfaces, or APIs, that we see in the technology space.
Thank you. And Gus says, thank you. You're eliminating him. We have another question here from Uday, and they're wondering, for data governance for data on-prem versus data governance for data on the cloud, is there a difference? Are they the same? Do you apply the same strategy to implement it?
I think for the most part, the lines are completely blurred now. I don't see there being a different kind of data governance depending on the different kind of technology. What you do have is, based on the tool sets or the limitations that your technology environment, or that your people environment, or that your operational environment, your business climate, or your regulatory restrictions, all of that stuff is going to be a factor in how you're able to achieve data governance or data leadership, right? And so those are all just attributes and factors that you're going to want to consider. Cloud versus on premises could be one of them. The most um you know the most important parts of that may be that on premises, you may be more constrained by your storage levels, or your computational horsepower available to you, or some of the tools that you have access to. But it doesn't fundamentally change the data governance. It just provides some details that need to be incorporated into your strategy, and your processes and procedures with the data governance effort that you have.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that, Anthony. Now, I'm wondering, you've described in beginning of the episode the first two chapters of your life, of your professional life.
Mhm.
What do you think that third chapter will look like, or what do you like it to look like?
Yeah, so I'd say the third chapter is about, taking these ideas that I've been forming for, act two, the kind of ideas formulation stage, and finding the way to extend them and make that broader based impact as best I can. And that's in my head today, it's a combination of continuing to do the kinds of educational things that I've been doing for a while, as well as applying this in the real world at large scale organizations that need these kinds of transformations. Because I've grown tired to a point of saying, hey, I'm a consultant, I'll tell you how to do this, go and do this now. I like doing it. I like being in the fight. I like making the change happen. And when those opportunities present themselves to be in it at, on the industry side, those are things that I think are going to be important. So being able to drive real change and extending it through education is where I see hopefully the rest of my career going. Continuing to learn, continuing to fine tune these ideas that I've been working on, but really trying to amplify the impact of the messages, amplify who receives them and who can put them to use, and really just trying to drive that maximum value through all of my activities, however they manifest. And that's really, like, I think about it this way, is that I've spent a long time learning and building these ideas. I really want to spend the remainder of my career applying them and making real value happen with them, however that manifests.
Wonderful. I love it. So, talking about ideas, can you give us maybe real life examples where companies or departments have used or have implemented these strategies and these ideas, and what the outcome was?
Yeah, I say, I think one of my favorite examples that I can talk about is when I was the chief data officer at the Chicago Transit Authority. It was actually a little bit
Mhm.
before I ended up taking the position, but that journey was one where we were really struggling as an organization. You imagine the buses and trains, right? Like, we ran the buses and trains for the city of Chicago, and one of the challenges is that we really didn't have good access to be able to run any analytics. Like, there was a demand, there was a desire to be able to do it, but the systems that existed at that time were very oriented towards the operational side. Like, you got to make the fare system work. Like, that's first step,
Yeah,
right? And so that's where the
exactly.
energy went very reasonably. But on the back end, it was very difficult to do the kinds of analytics and the kind of optimizations and take the kinds of actions driven by data that are so important for data leadership. And for me, when I saw the environment and the story, and it's in the book, and it's one of my favorites, is that when I got there as a consultant and I was looking at it, and I'm like, okay, I'm just trying to run a query. Just tell me how many people rode the bus or the train each day for a month. That should be a very simple inquiry of their data. That would take 42 minutes to run in our data analytics environment, but it also failed like 50% of the time. And so it was unusable, right? I mean, you can't work that way. And so I'm like, well, we have a bunch of great ideas of things they could do with data analytics. You cannot function and run the simplest query possible doing this. And so the natural reaction, and this is where data leadership was in my mind was starting to really come together, is that I said, hey, what do we need to do to create some data value here? I wasn't thinking quite in those terms, but it was like, what's the thing getting in our way the most? What's the bottleneck right now? It's the fact that you can't run a query. Like you can't do it. Okay, what do we do here? We have no money. We have very, great limitations on what we're able to do. There's a lot of restrictions on how we use data or whatever. We started to collaborate and talk to people and start to investigate and whatever. We ended up finding a cloud-based solution with a database, and I worked with the audit directors and the various folks at CTA to figure out a viable path. And we managed to go and build something in the span of weeks to put up a proof of concept to get to that same kind of number and some analytics basis and stuff. And it ended up being where for, a very small amount of money and a relatively small amount of time, we were able to take that query that ran 42 minutes, failed half the time, and we were able to run that in 8 seconds. And this is like, a month or two later. And I was able to actually demo that for the president of CTA at the time. And what that did was it showed, and it was kind of a visceral demo because the thing's just kind of spinning in the background. And then I'm like, here, watch this. And then this thing's done like immediately. And while, I come off as a little bit of a crazy person, he was also like, this is exactly what we need to do to be able to do all these other things. It's just like unlocking this world of possibility. And to me, it's that kind of simple action where you can do something to unlock a great amount of potential activity. Because think about all those queries that we were able to then run, all the analytics and all those people that just couldn't do anything in the current environment. We're talking hundreds of people that wanted to use data in some form or another. Creating a place where they could opened up a ton of efforts. This was not technically complicated. It was just, it needed some attention and it needed some deliberate action to say, here's what we can do. And that to me is one of the best examples of data leadership, because it doesn't need to be huge. It can be something where you just bring something into a place that can really start to drive meaningful activities and drive meaningful outcomes that can be measured from a business perspective. And that's what I think, like we go back to earlier when we were talking about like who should be doing data leadership. Well, it's all of us. We can all find those opportunities, even if it's something where I just create a slight improvement of my own process or my own way of working with something so that I can act much faster or I can, save an hour here or there.
I love these stories. Such positivity. It gives me so much confidence and optimism for the future.
So, Anthony, where can people find you? And what are you offering currently?
Yeah, so the best place is at my website, algmin.com. There's a section for data leadership. Check out the podcast. I think is probably the thing that I'm most proud of right now. And I think is an easy way to listen to some great conversations. The way I model it is it's me talking to people that I might otherwise be meeting at a conference that we haven't been able to go to for a while, and having a conversation about what their passions are, what they do, and learning from them in their particular area, and recognizing that it's all part of this data leadership story. And it's one more facet on this jewel of data and data leadership that we have. And that it just helps illuminate something that you may not otherwise have exposure to. And to me, that's something that I'm very fortunate to be able to do, is to find these guests and have these conversations. And they're fascinating to me. And so I love doing it just to have the conversation myself. And it's all bonus to be able to share that with an audience that has been increasing. And it's exciting to see how many people find these conversations to be interesting. And so that's the thing that I would recommend anybody check out, whether you're a technologist, a data person, a business leader. It doesn't matter. They're relevant for everybody. And then, I do training, and I do a lot of partnership with Dataverse, a lot of conferences and things like that. And we have other services, but to me, it's about saying, what do you need to do with data leadership? What do you need to accomplish in your roles? And then finding what kinds of services or what kinds of additional tools you need in your toolbox, and then figure out what those are. I may offer some, but there's a lot of ways to get a lot of those. And so to me, it's about taking that journey and helping folks any way I can, because I can. Like I want to help them be successful with data, because it's a great thing to do. Like these careers and the people that I've met in this community, I wouldn't want to do anything else. I really couldn't imagine a better career for me, and want to share that and bring others to it however possible. Because like I mentioned, there's not enough of us. We need way more people to be able to help our organizations thrive in a world of data and technology.
When I got into the field of data governance, data management, and I went to my first conference that was put together by Dataversity, I was surprised on how many more people were there that were having similar issues. They were dealing with similar challenges, and finally, my eyes sort of grew big, like the cat in the cartoons, sort of realizing that this is so much bigger but also more complex, and really how much I benefited from being part of the community and learning from people like Anthony here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I often said, like, especially when I first started going to those events, it was like, so often we as data people, self-identified data people, we feel like we're on islands in our organization some of the time, that we're the only ones championing some of these initiatives, and that we're the only ones who see some of this value. And then we go to a conference event like what Dataversity has, it's like, I'm not alone here. There are so many people having those similar kinds of experiences, struggling with similar kinds of things. Can we pool our collective knowledge together and find a better way and find more effective ways to do this and learn from each other? I think it's an incredible opportunity when you have those. And what I think, shows like yours and my data leadership lessons, what we're trying to do is extend those opportunities to the virtual world and those spaces between those events, when sometimes you need a new idea, sometimes you need a new way of approaching some things. And I think that the amount of resources for folks trying to learn this stuff now are unprecedented. We've never had this many. But then the challenges, it's one of my favorite sayings is like, as difficult and as challenging as things are today, it will never be easier than it is right now. And so it's something that I always remind myself of too. We've got to keep getting better if we want to keep pace.
So then, Anthony, I need to bring up this question. Do you have any advice on how can one nurture data culture as a data leader within an organization?
I think the most important thing is to lead by example, to really demonstrate. When I went to the president of CTA and I said, watch this, and showed him something, instead of saying, we have this great idea for a project, give me $1 million. Like that's not as helpful. So lead by example and start by quantifying, start by measuring, and start by giving yourself opportunities to find those things that will make an impact from a data value perspective. And that to me is key. Get into that habit and try new things, learn from the data and repeat, and then others will gravitate towards that. So first leading by example, and then helping others see what you're doing and help them start to learn and do those things as well. And I think that if you are in a position of kind of management authority, one of the most important things you can do is create a culture amongst your team where failure is not only accepted, but appreciated and cheered. And because to be iterative, and this is something that people forget about a lot. If you want to be iterative, if you want to be agile, there's a necessary component of that, which is imperfection. You cannot hold people to perfection and then ask them to iterate and improve.
Right.
You have to say, not only do we accept imperfection, not only do we accept mistakes, we champion them. We want them. We need them, because then there's opportunities to iterate and there's opportunities to learn and improve. And if we are in a culture that doesn't do that, data isn't going to help you, because you're going to ignore it even if you create all those capabilities. And I think it's an important leadership function, more so than a data related one. I think there's all these little gotchas that make it hard for data to be successful. And it comes back to a lot of the kind of core management, core leadership, core operational stuff that we contend with every day.
So paraphrasing Gandhi, be the data leader you want others to be.
Yeah, I like that.
I also like the saying, everything is a trial. And this takes, when you hear that, it takes out this idea of we need to be perfect. We're not allowed to make mistakes. So just to
Yeah.
reinforce what you said about iteration, I think that's important. And as a leader
Constant
to,
improvement.
yeah, exactly. And as a leader to reinforce that is, it's very powerful.
Yeah, and another way I like to think about it is everything's written in pencil. You know, we don't
Oh, I
have
like it. I
anything
love
that
it
we
so much.
can't change.
Yeah.
And if the data tells us we need to, we need to. And or we need to recognize that we are doing something for reasons other than the data. And sometimes that happens. And that can be frustrating, right? Because you can say, "Hey, I know what needs to change," and there will be no way you can actually make that change. But at least you
Mhm.
know that you're doing wrong. You know, at least you know you're not doing something for reasons outside of your control. Fine. You work with that. We all have to make those accommodations from time to time, but it's better knowing and then reacting when you do have an opportunity versus just ignoring it and hoping that
Correct.
you're going to guess right anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anthony, for being here, for taking the time, and for sharing such valuable insights, and for championing data leadership.
Thank you so
And
much for having
and
me.
thank
It's
you
been
for
great.
all the contribution to this field through all your courses and the podcast and the book. So everyone, make sure that you follow Anthony on LinkedIn, that you check out his website, algmin.com. And we will see you next time. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you very much for your questions, as always. Have a beautiful weekend, everyone.
Bye, everybody.